Today we're talking about a rule in personal injury law called the Eggshell Plaintiff Rule. Now, in personal injury law, we talk a lot about foreseeability and foreseeability of injuries. So, what would you expect, from a typical, motor vehicle accident where you're hitting somebody and you can kind of expect what the damages might be. This rule we're talking about today, the Eggshell Plaintiff Rule, turns that logic kind of on its head. It's a little bit different than our typical discussion of foreseeability in this context. So an example would be, you're in a parking lot, you kind of bump somebody, right? Doesn't feel like it would be a lot of damage, low speed, but some people get unlucky, and the person that you hit in that very, low maybe property damage accident actually turns out to be what we call an eggshell, someone who's particularly sensitive in some way, and suddenly you're facing a really large claim. So sometimes this rule doesn't seem fair, doesn't feel fair. And so I think that's something important that we're going to talk about today. And this actually, Rick, you want to talk about a good example of another case where this happened?
Yeah, and I also want to say this comes up all the time in actual practice, the eggshell plaintiff rule, or you take the plaintiff as you find them. We talk about that in at least half of the cases, because the injuries that somebody sustains in a car accident or any type of negligence case doesn't always comport with the actual mechanism of the injury. And a classic example is Benn v. Thomas. It was a Supreme Court case in 1994. And in that case, it was just a minor rear end car accident. The person who was rear ended had a pre-existing heart condition. And the impact of the collision, even though it wasn't great, he ended up hitting his chest against the seatbelt and had some very minor bruising. But then 6 days later, he passed away. And so the estate ended up suing the person who had who rear-ended him. And even though it was minor, it was a wrongful death. And, wrongful death cases, they go for like $8 million. So, it just didn't seem right. And you rear end somebody, and then all of a sudden you're liable for $8 million. And it would not be, like you were saying earlier, Mallory, it's not foreseeable that when you rear end somebody and it being a minor rear end accident, that you would be responsible for that person's death. So that
Absolutely.
just doesn't seem fair.
Yeah, it doesn't seem fair, and it's hard to tell what is fair because, you think about who should be responsible for that person's death if the accident did cause that injury, but it wasn't foreseeable. And so that's what this rule is about. So let's talk about what the rule actually is. The Eggshell Plaintiff Rule means that you take the plaintiff as you find them. So you don't consider them as the average person, right? Like, what would the average person have suffered in this situation? What would a healthier version of this person have suffered? You take them as the real human being who is actually injured. And so if someone is more vulnerable, if they do have a heart condition, or if they're mentally more vulnerable, and your negligence causes harm because of that, you're responsible for that harm, the harm that you actually caused, that actually occurred, even if most people in that situation wouldn't have been injured the same way. So the law doesn't focus on what could have happened or, what would have happened in an average scenario, but it focuses on what did happen in this scenario with this specific person.
Yeah, absolutely. And, anybody who's gone to law school will remember this case. It's Vosburg v. Putney. It was an 1891 case, so it was a long time ago, but this gets taught in law school all the time because it teaches this concept. And in this case, it was a schoolboy. He kicked another boy in the shin. They were just kind of playing around, but, he shouldn't kick anybody else in the shin. He did. And the kick wouldn't have seriously injured a normal, healthy kid. But this particular kid that he kicked had a pre-existing infection in his tibia, and it aggravated that infection. And it actually had severe complications and permanent injury. And the court, they had to make a decision, like, who would be responsible for this person's permanent injury? Clearly, the kid who kicked him was the one who caused it, because right afterwards, all these complications, they presented. And so the court ultimately ended up ruling that the kicker, who shouldn't have been kicking his, his playmate, was responsible. So it was a big decision.
Yeah, and people can struggle with this, right? It really sometimes doesn't feel fair to hold someone responsible for all this damage that was totally unforeseeable. People think, I barely hit them. In that case, I barely kicked him. It shouldn't have hurt that much. It shouldn't have caused that much damage. And now the consequences feel huge compared to the action that was taken. But there's two things that matter here in this legal context that we're talking about. First, in almost every case, insurance is going to be paying for this injury, right? There's a reason that we have insurance, car insurance, homeowners insurance, the kinds of insurance that would cover you under these kinds of circumstances. And so you can think about it feeling a little bit less unfair when it's, okay, well, I can't foresee that this happened, but that's why I have insurance, so that this person can still be made whole, right? And the second thing is, you don't get to choose who you hit. And some people are just more vulnerable people. And so someone needs to be held accountable for when those people are injured. And so when you think about it in that way, it does make a little bit more sense. And Rick, can you talk about sort of how courts deal with this, in terms of when a jury is assessing a case like this?
Absolutely. When we're talking to a jury at the end of the case, we provide the jury with pattern jury instructions that kind of instruct the jury, this is what the rules are, and this is how you should think about the case. And then you apply those facts to the jury instructions. One of the jury instructions that encapsulates this particular rule is the pre-existing condition aggravation jury instruction, which essentially says to the jury, if there is a pre-existing condition, and that pre-existing condition was made worse, then the defendant or the wrongdoer needs to pay for that worsening. And so that's essentially the eggshell plaintiff rule, is whatever that pre-existing condition is, so long as you made that pre-existing condition worse, even if it doesn't necessarily align with the wrongdoing, you got to pay for it all. So if the person had a pre-existing heart condition, like the example that I gave earlier, and by you hitting that person, rear-ending that person ends up passing away, well, that's definite worsening of their pre-existing heart condition. You got to pay for it. But the counter to that the defense jury instruction that often gets used as well, is they make the argument, if it was going to happen anyway, then you don't necessarily need to pay. You might need to pay for the speed in which it happened. So if you sped up that event from happening anyway. So essentially in the same heart attack case, you could make the argument as a defendant as he was going to have a heart attack anyway. And we know that because we could look at his arteries, his last scan, it was all clogged up. So he was going to have one anyway. And then, the argument could be, maybe we sped it up by a month or two, but he was likely going to have it anyway. So we'll be responsible for the increase in the speed and time that it happened, but we're not going to be responsible for the heart attack. So that would be the counter argument.
Yeah, and this is the heart attack situation is a good example because it makes a lot of sense if you think about it in terms of age, right? An 85-year-old person and a 20-year-old person have completely different bodies, right? And so a car accident that looks identical in two different situations, one person's 85 and one person's 20, that same collision can mean for the 20-year-old, they just have a little bit of soreness and they go on with their life. But for the older person, that can mean a loss of independence. That can mean a loss of mobility, a huge loss in their quality of life, potentially permanently, right? And so if you think about it in that context, it does make sense that someone needs to be held responsible for the making this person whole after an accident happens, an 85-year-old person being made whole is going to look a lot different than a 20-year-old person being made whole, even after the same accident.
Yeah, and that's a really good point because if you look at it from the bird's eye point of view, what tort law is really trying to do in all situations is you're trying to put the plaintiff back in the position that they would have been had they not been injured by somebody else's negligence. So, and that's the part that a lot of people misunderstand because what we're really trying to do in tort law is to compensate and put them back in the position or make them whole again. We're not trying to punish the other person. And that's the confusing part and the part that oftentimes when you're a juror, it's still that concept's very difficult to get out of your brain because the culpability of the negligence oftentimes influences the award. So if you did something really, really bad or really, really stupid, people will punish you for that by giving a bigger award. But that's not actually the goal in the law. The goal in the law is to put you back in the position that you were prior to getting into that accident, or in other words, make you whole again.
Yeah, and it can feel like a penalty because we use money to do that, right? Money is the primary tool that the law uses to make someone whole again. And so that can feel like a financial penalty when the damages are greater. Your financial responsibility to that person to make them whole goes up. And so it feels like a punishment. But the reality is we can't restore bodies. We can't undo an injury that happened. And so making someone whole, we recognize in the law that it's not actually possible to make someone completely whole again, but we can't give someone their life back that the way it looked before the injury, but we can compensate them with some kind of financial amount that we believe is equivalent to the damages that they've suffered. And so that's the tool that we use. It's not perfect, but it is the only substitute we have for that loss that was experienced because we can't restore them back to the pre-accident condition.
Yeah. And so the eggshell plaintiff rule, it doesn't always feel fair, but as the saying goes, you take the plaintiff as you find them.